Assalamu alaikum to everyone. This is Mohammad Ansar Uddin. I'm a Red Team member at SINAC and a security researcher at HackerOne. I'm also a student of computer science and engineering at AOB. As a penetration tester, I have experience in performing web and mobile application security assessments as well as network security assessments. In this session, I will discuss the basics of API hacking, including different types of API attacks, techniques used by hackers, and real-world examples of API hacks. I will also provide best practices. I hope this session will provide you with a better understanding of API security and help you identify potential vulnerabilities. Let's get started. Introduction to the concept of API hacking. So what exactly is API hacking? API hacking is the process of exploiting vulnerabilities in APIs in order to gain unauthorized access to data or systems. API or Application Programming Interface is a set of protocols and tools that allows different systems and applications to communicate with each other. APIs are used in a wide range of contexts, including web applications, mobile apps, IoT devices, and cloud services. As the use of API becomes more widespread, the risk of API hacking is also increasing. Types of API attacks. Now, let's take a look at the different types of API attacks. These vulnerabilities can occur due to a wide range of security threats such as injection attacks, authentication attacks, broken object level authorization, broken access control, security misconfiguration, and sensitive data exposure. These vulnerabilities can have serious consequences such as data breaches, unauthorized access to sensitive information, and loss of service availability. For example, a hacker could exploit an API vulnerability to steal sensitive data from a financial institution or disrupt services for a hospital. Case studies and examples of API hacks. Blind SQL injection in a REST API search endpoint. Let's start with the first example. In this example, the attacker is sending a GET request to the API endpoint with the query parameter of search. The single quotation and sleep 6 is a SQL command that will cause the database to sleep for 6 seconds. Methods to bypass a WAF using uppercase, lowercase, and UL encoding. An attacker can use a combination of uppercase, lowercase, and UL encoding in the payload to bypass a WAF that is configured to only detect payloads in a specific case. The impact of a successful WAF bypass can be severe as it allows an attacker to launch a successful SQL injection attack. This can lead to the unauthorized access of sensitive data such as user credentials and can also allow an attacker to execute arbitrary commands on the server. Boolean-based SQL injection in a passphrase generator REST API. Let's take a look at an example of this type of attack in action. Imagine that we have a random passphrase generator site that provides a REST API to generate passphrases with custom characters, length, and inclusion of numbers and symbols. However, an attacker can take advantage of this by sending a post request to the endpoint with a payload containing a SQL injection payload in the charset parameter. This payload will always return true, allowing the attacker to bypass the website security measures and retrieve a valid passphrase from the server. NoSQL injection to dump secret nodes in REST API. Now I'm going to talk about NoSQL injection and how it can be used to dump sensitive information and bypass security measures in REST APIs. NoSQL injection is a type of injection attack that targets NoSQL databases such as MongoDB, CouchDB. The attack is similar to SQL injection. Let's take a look at an example of a GET HTTP request and response that demonstrates a NoSQL injection attack targeting a REST API nodes endpoint. The payload $NE:null is a MongoDB command used to find all documents where the title field is not equal to null. The $var operator is a MongoDB operator that allows the execution of JavaScript code to filter the documents. It is used to filter the documents with the title containing the word secret and bypassing the web application firewall rules which are implemented to prevent NoSQL injection attacks. Common injections in a REST API. To give a better understanding of how common injection works, I'm going to walk you through an example of a hostname checker application. This application allows users to enter a hostname and checks its status. The application takes the hostname input from the user and passes it to a common interpreter on the server without proper validation. An attacker can take advantage of this by entering a hostname with malicious commands. These can be used to execute arbitrary code on the server, exfiltrate data, or launch further attacks. Log4j RC vulnerability in a REST API. Now I'm going to talk about a vulnerability that was discovered in the popular logging library Log4j. An attacker can exploit this vulnerability by crafting a malicious payload and passing it as the value of expired parameter in a GET request to the affected application. The payload would change the log4j configuration file to point to file control by the attacker, which would then be executed on the affected system. This type of attack is known as the blind out of band OOB attack because the attackers can see the response from the server. It's always a good practice to keep your application updated and to be aware of the latest security vulnerabilities. Node.js deserialization in REST API. Now let's talk about unsafe deserialization. So what exactly is unsafe deserialization? In simple terms, it occurs when user input is used to deserialize untrusted data, allowing attackers to execute arbitrary code or carry out other malicious actions. This vulnerability can occur when deserializing any type of data, not just JSON, and it can be extremely dangerous if left unmitigated. As you can see, the API is using the value of the title parameter to deserialize untrusted data. This is where the vulnerability lies. An attacker can insert malicious code into the title parameter, which will execute arbitrary code when deserialized by the API. This can allow the attacker to gain unauthorized access to sensitive data or execute other malicious actions on the server. Excessive vulnerability in the search user's endpoint of a SOAP API service. This vulnerability occurs when a web service that parses XML input is not properly sanitizing user-provided data, allowing an attacker to inject malicious XML data into the service. One example of how this vulnerability can be exploited is through a SOAP web API services search user's endpoint. In this scenario, an attacker could craft a malicious post request containing a search username request with a payload that includes a malicious doc type declaration and an entity declaration that attempts to read a sensitive file on the server, such as the /etc/passwd file. This type of attack is a serious concern as it can lead to the expose of sensitive information as well as other malicious actions such as data theft, data manipulation, or even system compromise. 404 not found directory traversal bypass to access database credentials in REST API. Now let's talk about directory path traversal. First, let me explain what directory path traversal is. Directory traversal, also known as file path traversal, is a web security vulnerability that allows an attacker to read arbitrary files on the server that is running an application. This might include application code and data, credentials for backend systems, and sensitive operating system files. Now let me give you an example of how this vulnerability can be exploited. Imagine a REST API endpoint that is vulnerable to directory path traversal located at /API/version2/file. Let's jump into the story. When I was checking for a path traversal bug on the file endpoint, it was showing a 404 not found. Then I successfully bypassed it with a path traversal by encoding %2e, %2e, %2f. The server responds with a 200 OK status code and the content of the file, which includes the database credentials, MySQL databases, user and password. Additionally, many modern web application firewalls are able to detect and block this type of attack. So bypassing the WAF would be required for a successful exploit. Bypassing the URL parser to gain access to the API. URL parsing is the process of breaking down a URL into its individual components, such as the protocol, domain name, and path, in order to analyze the request and determine if it is valid or malicious. However, attackers have found ways to bypass these WAFs by using certain techniques. There are several methods that can be used to bypass URL parser-based WAFs, including special characters that can be used to bypass URL parse-based security controls. They are often used in URL injection and path traversal attacks. These characters can be used to manipulate the URL and bypass security checks. URL encoded characters. By using the URL encoded characters in the request, attackers can bypass some WAFs that are only looking for specific characters in the URL. For example, using a URL encoded forward slash instead of a regular forward slash in the path could potentially bypass some WAFs. Using double triple encoding, applying URL encoding more than once on a specific payload, this may allow bypassing some WAFs that only decode the payload once. Using a different encoding format, some WAFs may only look for URL encoding and not other encoding formats such as base64. Using a non-printable characters, some WAFs may not be able to parse non-printable characters such as ASI to control characters, which can be used to bypass the WAF. Null byte injection. By using a null byte %00 at the end of the URL, attackers can bypass some WAFs that are unable to parse the null byte. HTTP verb tampering. HTTP verb tampering is another method where attackers modify the HTTP verb, example, changing a GET request to a POST request to bypass some WAFs that are only looking for specific HTTP verbs in the request. HTTP parameter pollution. HTTP parameter pollution is a technique where attackers inject multiple parameters with the same name and different values in the request, which can bypass some WAFs that are only looking at the first parameter value. Host header. An attacker can manipulate the host header to point to a different server or endpoint, bypassing the URL parse-based security controls and gaining access to sensitive information. Bypassing the URL parser to gain access to memory dumps and environment disclosures via the Spring Boot actuator. URL parser bypass is a method that can be used to access memory dump and environment disclosure via Spring Boot actuator. This method involves manipulating the URL to bypass the URL parse-based security controls in place and gain access to sensitive information. IDER vulnerability to access any user's PI data via JavaScript analysis. Now I will discuss an IDER vulnerability that I discovered through analyzing a JavaScript file. The vulnerability can be found in the registration process of the application, specifically in the JavaScript file called registrationhelper.js. In this file, there is a function called getPhoneNumber and QID, which takes in a parameter called customer number. This function makes a POST request to the server, passing in the customer number parameter in the body of the request. The server then responds with the phone number and QID of the customer, which can be used to access the customer's PA data. The attack can be carried out in two steps. The first step is to enumerate customer numbers until a valid QID is found. This can be done by making the multiple POST requests to the server, each time passing in a different customer number. Once a valid QID is found, the attacker can use it in the second step of the attack. In the second step, the attacker makes a POST request to a different endpoint, passing in the QID as a parameter. This endpoint returns the PI data of the customer associated with the QID. This vulnerability is a serious security issue that could lead to the unauthorized disclosure of sensitive user information. Access to the internal admin API of the support portal. I discovered this vulnerability by analyzing a JavaScript file on the website. In the file, I found credentials for the company's internal admin API. The credentials were in the form of a username and password, which I then merged and encoded to base64. In order to exploit this vulnerability, I researched the documentation for the Freshdesk API. After research, I found that by using these credentials, I could access a number of different endpoints on the API, including list all ticket fields, list all contact, view account, list all email configs. To exploit this vulnerability, an attacker could use a simple HTTP request and use the encoded credentials as the authorization. The impact of this vulnerability is that an attacker could use these credentials to do anything that an internal admin user could do on the support portal. I reported this vulnerability to the company and they have since fixed it, but I wanted to share this with you to raise awareness about the importance of securing credentials and monitoring accesses to internal APIs. Now let's talk about authentication bypass through response manipulation on dev portal. This vulnerability allows an attacker to bypass the authentication process and gain full access to the dashboard. In order to exploit this vulnerability, an attacker could use a simple HTTP request and intercept the response. By inputting any email and password, the attacker creates a request that is sent to the server. The server then responds with a 401 unauthorized status code and a message indicating that the login was invalid. However, by modifying the response to 200 OK and changing the message to login success, the attacker can bypass the authentication process and gain access to the dashboard. This vulnerability is a serious issue as it allows an attacker to gain access to sensitive information and potentially cause damage to the company. I would like to share my bounty screenshot for motivation. Additional resources for further learning. I have provided a cheat sheet that covers the basics of server-side injection and its different types, as well as common techniques for exploiting vulnerabilities. I encourage you to follow the tips outlined in this cheat sheet, such as understanding how to bypass input validation and WAPs, familiarizing yourself with common server-side injection techniques, and practicing identifying and exploiting server-side injection vulnerabilities in a safe and legal environment. In conclusion, API hacking is a complex and ever-evolving field that requires a deep understanding of web application security. In the end, this session is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to API security. It's important to always stay up to date with the latest technique and countermeasures and to continue learning about API security. Remember to always practice in a safe and legal environment and be ethical in your testing. Thank you.